Patricia Paleo stood in the marble lobby of Norway's government pension fund global headquarters in Oslo, watching fund managers discuss the morning's oil revenues with the casual efficiency of bankers processing deposits. Across the Atlantic, in Lagos, petroleum engineers began their shift at the same moment, extracting the same black substance from similar geological formations. Both nations possessed abundant oil reserves. Both had discovered petroleum wealth around the same era. Yet one had become the world's most successful sovereign wealth fund, while the other remained trapped in what economists call the resource curse. The conventional explanation for this divergence is deceptively simple. Norway succeeded because of good governance, transparency, and strong institutions. Nigeria failed because of corruption, ethnic divisions, and weak state capacity. This narrative is so widely accepted that it has become economic orthodoxy. But Patricia realized this explanation contained a fundamental flaw. It treated these outcomes as inevitable consequences of national character rather than examining the global system that produced such different results for similar endowments. Contrary to popular belief, the resource curse is not about geography, culture, or governance. It is about power. It is about which nations are allowed to control their resource wealth and which are compelled to surrender it to global markets. The difference between Norway and Nigeria reveals not the triumph of Nordic institutions over African corruption, but the architecture of a world system that determines winners and losers before the first barrel of oil is ever extracted. The timing deception. The story begins with a lie embedded in every economics textbook. Both Norway and Nigeria are described as oil-rich nations that discovered petroleum wealth in the 1960s and 1970s. This framing suggests they started from similar positions and diverged due to domestic policy choices. But the timing tells a different story entirely. When Norway discovered oil in the North Sea in 1969, it was already a developed industrial economy with strong democratic institutions, an educated workforce, and established relationships with global financial markets. The petroleum wealth arrived as a bonus to an already functioning modern state. Nigeria's oil industry, by contrast, was developed during the colonial period by British companies who designed the extraction system to serve imperial rather than domestic needs. When Nigeria gained independence in 1960, it inherited an oil infrastructure built to export wealth, not capture it. Patricia examined the legal frameworks that governed oil extraction in both countries. Norway negotiated its petroleum contracts as a sovereign nation with existing industrial capacity and legal expertise. It demanded majority stakes in offshore projects, insisted on technology transfer, and required foreign companies to partner with Norwegian firms. Nigeria inherited concession agreements negotiated by colonial administrators who had little incentive to secure favorable terms for a future independent state. The difference was not cultural or institutional, it was structural. Norway entered the oil age as a developed nation capable of imposing terms on multinational corporations. Nigeria entered as a newly independent state whose petroleum sector had been designed by and for foreign interests. The sovereignty illusion. But timing alone cannot explain the persistence of different outcomes. Patricia discovered that the resource curse mythology obscures a more fundamental distinction: the difference between nominal and actual sovereignty over natural resources. Norway's petroleum wealth flows through Equinor, the state-controlled energy company that maintains operational control over most Norwegian oil and gas production. The company operates as an arm of Norwegian strategic policy, reinvesting profits domestically and internationally according to government priorities. When global oil prices fluctuate, Norway captures both the upside and downside through direct ownership. Nigeria's petroleum sector operates through a complex web of joint ventures, production sharing agreements, and service contracts with international oil companies. While the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation nominally controls the country's oil resources, operational control remains largely in foreign hands. When oil prices rise, the benefits flow primarily to multinational corporations and their shareholders. When prices fall, the costs are absorbed by the Nigerian state. This arrangement was not accidental or inevitable. It was designed during the colonial period and reinforced through decades of structural adjustment programs imposed by international financial institutions. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund consistently pressured Nigeria to liberalize its petroleum sector, privatize state-owned enterprises, and reduce its government participation in oil production. Norway faced no such pressure because it already possessed the institutional capacity that international lenders demanded. The result is a system where Nigeria extracts oil but does not control oil wealth, while Norway both extracts and controls its petroleum resources. This distinction explains why Norwegian oil revenues accumulate in a sovereign wealth fund worth over 1.3 trillion, while Nigerian oil revenues disappear into debt service, import bills, and capital flight. The conventional narrative attributes these outcomes to institutional differences between Nordic social democracy and African patrimonialism. This explanation satisfies our need for moral clarity, but ignores the role of external actors in shaping institutional outcomes. Patricia traced the history of institutional development in both countries and found a pattern that contradicted the standard account. Norway's petroleum institutions were not ancient Nordic traditions, but recent innovations developed specifically to manage oil wealth. The Government Pension Fund Global was established in 1990, decades after oil discovery. The regulatory framework governing offshore drilling was created in the 1970s through conscious policy choices. Nigeria attempted to build similar institutions multiple times. The Petroleum Trust Fund, established in 1994, was designed to capture oil revenues for long-term investment. The Excess Crude Account, created in 2004, aimed to save windfall petroleum profits. The Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority, launched in 2011, sought to emulate Norway's wealth fund model. Each initiative failed not because of inherent institutional weakness, but because of external pressure to liberalize the petroleum sector. International lenders consistently opposed policies that would allow the Nigerian government to retain control over oil revenues. Structural adjustment programs required the privatization of state-owned enterprises, the reduction of fuel subsidies, and the elimination of foreign exchange controls. These policies systematically dismantled the institutional infrastructure needed to capture resource rents. Norway faced no equivalent pressure because it was already a developed economy integrated into Western financial markets. The same international institutions that demanded liberalization from Nigeria praised Norway's state-controlled approach to petroleum management. The corruption distraction. Perhaps no aspect of the resource Curse mythology is more persistent than the explanation that corruption causes resource-rich developing nations to squander their natural wealth. This narrative is particularly powerful because corruption is undeniably present in Nigeria's petroleum sector. But Patricia realized that focusing on corruption obscures more fundamental questions about how the global economy is organized. Corruption in Nigeria's oil sector typically takes the form of inflated service contracts, kickbacks on licensing deals, and the diversion of petroleum revenues to private accounts. These practices are harmful and should be condemned. But the scale of wealth lost to corruption pales in comparison to the structural transfer of value through the legal operation of international petroleum markets. Consider the economics of oil extraction. When ExxonMobil operates in Nigeria, it typically retains 60–70% of petroleum revenues after paying taxes and royalties to the Nigerian government. When Equinor operates in Norway, the Norwegian government captures 70–80% of petroleum revenues through taxes, royalties, and direct ownership. The difference between these arrangements far exceeds the amount lost to corruption in either country. The focus on corruption serves a specific ideological function. It locates the problem within developing nations rather than examining the global system that produces systematic wealth transfers from resource-rich developing countries to multinational corporations and their home governments. It suggests that Nigeria could achieve Norwegian outcomes simply by improving governance, rather than questioning why the same global institutions that praise Norwegian state control demand Nigerian privatization. The geographic accident. The deepest layer of the resource curse mythology is the assumption that Norway and Nigeria represent natural experiments in resource management. This framing suggests that geography randomly distributed oil wealth to different types of societies, allowing us to observe how institutions affect outcomes. But Patricia discovered that this geographic accident interpretation ignores the historical forces that created contemporary institutional differences. Norway's oil reserves lie beneath the North Sea, in waters adjacent to the world's most developed economies. The technology needed to extract offshore petroleum was developed by companies based in Norway, Britain, and the Netherlands. The financial markets needed to fund exploration were located in London, Amsterdam, and Oslo. The regulatory expertise required to manage complex offshore projects existed within European government agencies. Nigeria's oil reserves lie beneath the Niger Delta, in a region that had been systematically underdeveloped during the colonial period. The technology needed for extraction had to be imported from Western countries. The capital required for development came from multinational corporations seeking to export petroleum to global markets. The expertise needed for regulation was concentrated in the offices of international oil companies rather than government agencies. These differences were not accidents of geography, but consequences of centuries of uneven development produced by colonialism, slavery, and systematic wealth extraction. Norway's institutional advantages were built through participation in European imperial projects that simultaneously underdeveloped regions like the Niger Delta. The system revealed. Patricia's investigation revealed that the resource curse is not a natural phenomenon affecting unfortunate nations, but a policy outcome produced by the structure of the global economy. Resource-rich developing countries experience the curse not because they lack good institutions, but because the global system is designed to extract their wealth regardless of their institutional capacity. The evidence is overwhelming. once you look beyond individual country comparisons. Every developed nation with significant natural resource endowments successfully avoided the resource curse. Norway, Canada, Australia, the United States. Every developing nation with similar endowments experienced some version of the curse. Nigeria, Venezuela, Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo. This pattern cannot be explained by cultural differences, institutional capacity, or governance quality. It can only be explained by the differential treatment that developed and developing nations receive from international markets, financial institutions, and regulatory systems. The resource curse mythology serves to legitimize this differential treatment by suggesting that outcomes reflect domestic failures rather than systemic inequalities. It allows the global community to celebrate Norwegian success while ignoring the mechanisms that produce Nigerian failure. Understanding the resource curse as a policy outcome rather than a natural phenomenon opens possibilities for different approaches to resource management, but it requires abandoning comfortable narratives about cultural differences and confronting uncomfortable truths about how global wealth is actually distributed. The choice between Norwegian success and Nigerian failure is not predetermined by geography, institutions, or culture. It is a political choice embedded in the structure of the international system. And like all political choices, it can be changed.